Caroline Walker's mansion in Boston's upscale Beacon Hill neighborhood gleamed in the spring sunlight. The light streaming through the windows danced across the carefully selected furniture and brightened the marble countertops. She savored her morning coffee slowly while gazing at the garden outside her window. Caroline was one of Boston's most successful real estate agents. Her business card bore the tagline, "Helping you find your dream home," which wasn't just marketing, it was her genuine belief. Caroline was passionate about understanding each client's hopes and dreams, and finding the perfect home to match. "You're still up." James, her husband who had just entered the kitchen, gently kissed Caroline's shoulder. James worked as a senior executive at a prestigious investment bank in Boston. His warm smile and intelligent gaze were the features that had made Caroline fall in love with him at first sight 15 years ago. "Yes, I have the Bradford account today." "They're really demanding," Caroline said with a smile. "But I think I've found the perfect property for them." "You'll be fine," James said, lightly touching her hair. "You've always been good at winning clients over." Caroline and James's marriage was envied by many. Though they had no children, a choice they had accepted, they instead devoted their time to careers and hobbies. Caroline loved yoga and reading, while James was passionate about sailing. On weekends, they made time to visit art museums together or enjoy dinners with friends. That afternoon, Caroline had a lunch date with Diane Harris, her longtime friend. They had been friends since college and had weathered life's ups and downs together. "Hey, Dee," Caroline said, picking at her salad. "My parents are coming this weekend." Diane gave her a sympathetic look. "That conversation again?" Caroline sighed. "Yes, I'm sure I'll get another lengthy lecture about our choice not to have children." Her parents, Margaret and Howard Johnson, had always meddled in their daughter's life and marriage. They were particularly critical of the couple's choice not to have children. "At our age, we'd like to see our grandchildren," Margaret would say every time. "Mom, please stop. I want you to respect James and my decision," Caroline always answered. Nevertheless, Caroline supported her parents financially and regularly hosted family gatherings. She always carried a sense of guilt about not being able to satisfy her parents. Recently, Caroline had sensed subtle changes in her marriage. James had become busier with work, and their time together was gradually diminishing. He was working late more frequently than before and his overseas business trips had increased. "James feels a bit distant lately," Caroline confided her concerns to Diane. "He seems to be hiding something." "Men are like that," Diane said, gently squeezing her hand. "It's probably work stress. You two are the perfect couple." As Caroline was heading back to her office after leaving the cafe, her cell phone rang. It was James. "Caroline, I've made plans for our anniversary," his voice sounded excited. "I thought we needed time to reconnect. I've booked a 2-day trip on a private yacht. How about this weekend?" Caroline stopped in her tracks, her heart filling with surprise and joy. "James, that sounds wonderful. I feel bad about my parents, but this time I'm prioritizing us." After hanging up, Caroline looked up at the sky and smiled. "This will bring our relationship back to normal," she whispered to herself. On the morning of their departure, Caroline woke to sunlight streaming through the window. James was still sleeping beside her. Looking at her husband's peaceful face, she smiled quietly. After all these years, his face still held the gentleness and intelligence that had first attracted her. Caroline slipped quietly out of bed and went to make morning coffee. In the kitchen, she picked up her cell phone and called Diane. "Good morning, Dee. We're heading out on our yacht trip today," Caroline said, unable to hide her excitement. "Have a wonderful time," Diane's voice was warm and encouraging. "This will be important for you too. Relax and make beautiful memories." "Thank you. We really needed this trip," Caroline said, looking out the window. "James has changed lately. But this morning, I feel that old gentleness from him for the first time in a while." After hanging up, James came downstairs. He seemed brighter than usual, and as he approached Caroline, he put his arm around her waist and gave her a light kiss. "Good morning, my love," his voice was warm and full of tenderness. "Today is going to be special." After breakfast and finishing their packing, they got into James's black Lexus. On the way to the pier, James took Caroline's hand, occasionally giving her affectionate glances.
Do you know some people earn over $10,000 a month just by posting Reddit stories on YouTube? No face, no voice, just a laptop. I do it too. Link below if you're curious.
When they arrived at the marina, they were escorted to a beautiful yacht named Serenity. With its pure white hull and gleaming teak deck, the yacht was the epitome of luxury. "I reserved this yacht for a special moment," James said, putting his arm around her waist. "I want to cherish our time together." Caroline smiled with joy. "It's too wonderful, James." After a brief explanation from the captain, they placed their luggage in the cabin. The spacious cabin had a large bed, and a small bouquet and chilled champagne were placed on the table. As the yacht left the harbor and began to move into the calm sea, Caroline went out on deck and took a deep breath, feeling the sea breeze. James stood beside her, bringing 2 champagne glasses. "Cheers," he raised his glass. "To our new beginning." "To new beginnings," Caroline replied with a smile, gently clinking her glass against his. That afternoon, they sunbathed on the deck, enjoying the peaceful time spent on the water. James talked about his recent work and spoke passionately about a new project at the bank. Caroline listened to his words, feeling a sense of reassurance at seeing the sparkle in his eyes after so long. "I'm proud of your success," James suddenly said. "Your reputation in the real estate industry is truly remarkable. I've always been watching your success from the sidelines." "Thank you," Caroline answered with gratitude. "I couldn't be where I am without your support." By evening, the sky had turned a beautiful orange, and the horizon gleamed golden. James had arranged a special dinner. The table was set with white linen, silver candelabras, and roses. The lavish seafood dinner prepared by the chef was like something from a luxury restaurant. "Thank you for planning such a beautiful evening," Caroline said gratefully. "You deserve it." James took her hand and kissed it lightly. After dinner, James brought a portable speaker to the deck and played the song they had first danced to at their wedding. "May I have this dance?" He extended his hand. Caroline surrendered herself to her husband's arms, and they danced slowly under the starry sky. She rested her head on his chest, feeling his heartbeat, wrapped in a sense of happiness. "I haven't been this happy in a long time," Caroline said softly. "Neither have I," James answered, burying his face in her hair. "You're the treasure of my life." That night, Caroline went to bed with a sense of security she hadn't felt in a long time. In James's arms, she felt all her anxieties melt away. However, at midnight, Caroline woke up thirsty. Noticing that James wasn't in bed, she decided to look for him while getting a drink of water. When she left the cabin, she saw James standing at the edge of the deck. He had his phone to his ear and was speaking quietly. Caroline was about to approach when she heard his words. "Everything is going according to plan. It will be over by tomorrow morning." Caroline stopped in her tracks. There was a coldness in James's voice that she didn't recognize. He said something more, but it was drowned out by the sound of the waves. Filled with anxiety, Caroline quickly hid. With her heart pounding, she quietly returned to the cabin and lay down. What was happening? An anniversary surprise? Or a work emergency? She tried to reassure herself. A few minutes later, James returned to the cabin. Caroline pretended to be asleep. "Are you awake?" James asked softly. Caroline slowly opened her eyes. "Yes, I'm thirsty." "I'll get you some water," he said kindly. After drinking the water, Caroline began to feel tired. Her head felt strangely heavy. "I have a bit of a headache," she murmured. "Take this," James offered a small pill. It's your anxiety medication. It will help you sleep well. Caroline took the pill and lay down on the bed. She felt her consciousness slipping away as James's hand gently stroked her hair. Tomorrow is a new beginning, were James's words that she heard before completely losing consciousness. In the morning, Caroline woke up with a severe headache and nausea. Her mouth was dry, and her body felt as heavy as lead. She slowly sat up and looked around. James wasn't in bed. "James," she called out, but there was no answer. She dragged herself out of the cabin. The boat rocked gently, and the sea was calm. But there was no sign of people on the deck. "James," she called again, this time louder. Caroline searched the entire yacht. The captain's cabin, engine room, all the guest rooms, but James was nowhere to be found. Even more mysteriously, all his belongings had disappeared. His suitcase, wallet, watch, and even his cell phone, everything was gone. Panic seized her. She went back out on deck and looked around at the surrounding sea. There was only the blue sea stretching in all directions, with no other boats or land in sight. Caroline operated the radio with trembling hands and contacted the Coast Guard. "Help me," her voice trembled with fear. When the rescue team member descended from the helicopter and landed on the deck, Caroline hurried toward them. "Please help. My husband has disappeared," she cried. However, the expressions on the team members' faces were not the sympathy or understanding she had expected. Their eyes were cold and wary. "Mrs. Walker?" the lead team member asked. "Yes, that's me. Please find my husband. He hasn't shown himself all night. We'll search the area around the yacht. Please wait here." The team members began searching the sea area around the yacht. Caroline sat on a deck bench, wrapped in a blanket, waiting. As time passed, her anxiety increased. Why weren't they asking her questions? Why weren't they trying to learn more details? About an hour later, a small boat approached, and a man and woman in uniforms boarded. The backs of their jackets read, "Police." "Are you Caroline Walker?" the older male detective asked. "I'm Detective Johnson, and this is Detective Parker." "Yes, I am." Caroline stood up. "Have you found my husband?" "Not yet," Detective Johnson answered coldly. "We'd like to ask you some questions." Caroline nodded. The detectives led her to the cabin, where they sat across from each other at the table. "Was there an argument between you and your husband last night?" Detective Johnson asked. "No," Caroline shook her head. "We were having a wonderful time. It was our anniversary celebration." Detective Parker wrote something in a small notebook. Nothing could be read from her expression. "Were there any problems in your marriage?" Detective Johnson continued. "James has been busy with work lately. But this trip was meant to rekindle our relationship," Caroline answered honestly. "I see," Detective Johnson said coolly. "Mrs. Walker, blood stains have been found on the yacht's gunwale." The blood drained from Caroline's face. "Blood? That's..." And, the detective interrupted her, "blood has also been detected on a heavy wine bottle with your fingerprints." The air in the room froze. Caroline couldn't believe her ears. "What are you saying?" she said in a trembling voice. "I didn't do anything." "How much alcohol did you consume last night?" 2 glasses of champagne and 1 glass of wine with dinner," Caroline answered. "But I felt strangely sleepy last night. I had a headache." "Did you take any sleeping medication?" "Yes, James gave me my anxiety medication." The detectives exchanged meaningful glances. The questioning continued for another hour. Caroline explained the same things over and over: the wonderful evening with James, how she'd heard him on the phone in the middle of the night, and how he was gone in the morning. However, the detectives' attitudes grew increasingly cold. Eventually, they moved Caroline to a Coast Guard vessel and returned to land. Media had gathered at the port. Camera flashes were directed at her face, and reporters shouted questions. "Mrs. Walker, did you kill your husband? Was there a fight? How much is James Walker's life insurance?" Caroline had a blanket placed over her head and was pushed into a police car. She was confused. She couldn't understand what was happening. The questioning at the police station grew more intense. Despite having a lawyer present, Caroline felt cornered. And the most shocking moment came when she was allowed to return home, only to find police waiting with a search warrant. "Caroline Walker," Detective Johnson said at the front door. "This is a search warrant." Caroline received the warrant with trembling hands. As she watched, police officers began searching throughout the house. They examined her drawers, closets, computer, and file cabinets. After a while, a young officer came out of the study. "Detective, look at this," he handed over an envelope. Detective Johnson opened it and checked the contents. His expression hardened. "Mrs. Walker, what is this?" He showed Caroline the document. It was James's life insurance policy. A $5 million policy with Caroline as the sole beneficiary. Caroline trembled. This is my husband's insurance. It's only natural, as he works as a senior executive at an investment bank. What's interesting," the detective said coldly, "is that the amount of this insurance was recently doubled." Caroline couldn't respond. She hadn't known about that fact. The police further seized her diary, recent bank account movements, and notes about her relationship with James. Caroline's diary contained complaints about James's long working hours and his strange behavior. "Caroline Walker," Detective Johnson finally said, "I am arresting you on suspicion of the murder of James Walker. You have the right to remain silent." Caroline's world collapsed. She said in a trembling voice, "This is a mistake. I loved my husband." No one listened to her words. The trial began 3 months later. During that time, Caroline had paid bail and was under house arrest, but her life had completely changed. Friends avoided her, her reputation in the real estate industry plummeted, and clients canceled contracts one after another. Walking down the courthouse corridor, Caroline was overcome with a sense of being in a nightmare. Her lawyer, Michael Green, was excellent, but the evidence was against her. The prosecution argued that Caroline had learned of her husband's affair and killed him out of anger and for the insurance money. They read quotes from her diary out of context, presented evidence that her sleeping medication had been detected in James's drink, and submitted the blood stains and fingerprints as evidence. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," prosecutor Elizabeth Morris said, "the defendant made a perfect plan. She drugged her husband, struck him with a wine bottle, and threw him into the sea. Then she reported him as missing in an attempt to collect the $5 million insurance." Caroline trembled and grabbed her lawyer's sleeve. "No, no," she whispered. However, the most shocking testimony came from her best friend, Diane. Caroline felt a small sense of relief seeing Diane approach the witness stand. Surely her best friend would prove her innocence. "Miss Harris," the prosecutor asked, "what did the defendant say about her husband?" Diane looked at Caroline for a moment, then looked away. Caroline knew about her husband's affair. A shock ran through the courtroom. "Caroline told me many times that she wanted to kill James," Diane testified on the stand. She suspected James was having a relationship with a young woman. Her suspicions grew stronger, especially when his recent business trips increased. Caroline let out a desperate cry. "That's a lie." "Diane, why?" The judge ordered her to be silent. Caroline covered her face with trembling hands and cried. Her world was collapsing. She couldn't understand why Diane had betrayed her. Even more shocking was that even Caroline's parents testified against her. Margaret Johnson was on the witness stand with a stern expression. "My daughter has had severe anger issues since childhood," Margaret stated calmly. "She would throw tantrums when she couldn't get something. That tendency continued into adulthood. I wouldn't be surprised if she did something. Caroline's lawyer desperately argued, there is no evidence of problems between the defendant and her husband. On the contrary, they were traveling to celebrate their anniversary. However, the prosecution's evidence was overwhelming. The wine bottle recovered from the yacht had Caroline's fingerprints and her husband's blood on it. Her sleeping medication was detected in James's system. And above all, the existence of the life insurance was explained as giving Caroline a strong motive. On the day of the closing arguments, the courtroom was filled with tension. Caroline had barely slept, her face was pale, with dark shadows under her eyes. When her turn came, she walked to the witness stand on shaky legs. "I am innocent," she said to the court. "I loved James. I can't imagine hurting him." Prosecutor Morris pressed her, "Then why did your diary contain complaints about your husband? Why did you contact the insurance company the day before the yacht trip?" "I didn't contact the insurance company," Caroline cried. "Your cell phone records indicate otherwise," Morris said coldly. When the jury retired for deliberation, Caroline whispered to her lawyer, "This is a nightmare." It took 6 hours for the jury to return. Their expressions were stern, and Caroline's heart raced. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked. The jury foreman stood up. "Yes, Your Honor." "How do you find the defendant, Caroline Walker, on the charge of second-degree murder?" "Guilty," the jury foreman's voice echoed like a hammer through the courtroom. Caroline's world collapsed. She fell to the floor, and her lawyer supported her. "I'm innocent. Someone help," she cried, but no one listened. A week later, the sentence was handed down. The judge sentenced Caroline to 15 years in prison. In the police vehicle heading to prison, Caroline looked out the window and vowed, "Someday I will reveal the truth." The iron gates of the Massachusetts State Women's Correctional Facility opened, and Caroline Walker became a free woman after 15 years. Though she still retained shadows of her former beauty, her face bore deep lines from prison life. Her once rich blonde hair had now turned gray, and her confident walk had become more cautious and wary. "Mrs. Walker, these are your belongings," the reception officer handed her a small bag. "And this is your release money." Caroline nodded silently and took the bag. Inside were the watch, wedding ring, and wallet she had been wearing on the day she was arrested. She stared at the ring, then slowly slipped it into her pocket. Outside the prison, no one was waiting for her. Her connections with former friends and family had been severed with the guilty verdict. She had nothing left, no home, no career, no social standing. "This is the beginning of my real battle," she murmured with determination. Caroline took a bus to a small town in the Boston suburbs. With the help of a prison social worker, she had found an inexpensive apartment before her release. It was a simple one-room dwelling on the 3rd floor of an old building, but it was enough for her now. Arriving at the apartment and putting down her few belongings, Caroline stood by the window and gazed at the view of the town. 15 years ago, she had lived in an upscale Boston neighborhood and made a name for herself as a successful real estate agent. Now, her world had shrunk to this small room. However, a light of determination shone in her eyes. During her 15 years in prison, Caroline had lived for one purpose: to reveal the truth. She had studied law in the prison library and researched every detail of her case. And as soon as her parole was granted, she had begun a correspondence course to obtain a private investigator's license. "James, where are you?" she whispered, breathing on the window glass. "And why did Diane and Mom and Dad betray me?" The next day, Caroline began moving early in the morning. She first visited the office of her former lawyer, Michael Green. Michael was one of the few people who had believed in her innocence until the end. "Caroline," Michael wore a surprised expression when he saw her. "I heard you were out, but I didn't expect to see you so soon." "I don't have time, Michael," Caroline said as she sat down. I need the files from my case. Michael stared at her. What are you planning to do? Find the truth, she answered quietly but with determination. James is alive. I intend to prove that and restore my honor. Michael exhaled deeply. Caroline, it's been 15 years. The evidence has gone cold, and witnesses' memories have faded. But the truth hasn't changed, Caroline argued. I'm innocent, Michael. You know that, don't you? Michael looked at her for a while, then nodded. All right. I'll help as much as I can. From that day, Caroline's new life began. She worked as a receptionist at a small company while continuing her private investigator training at night. Most of her income went to investigation expenses. A few months later, Caroline succeeded in obtaining the files for her case. She used an entire wall of her apartment to arrange all the information, photos, and testimonies related to the case in chronological order. At the center was a photo of her missing husband, James. The first clue is Diane, she murmured, looking up at the wall. Caroline began investigating her former best friend's current situation. According to public records, Diane Harris still lived in Boston, but no longer in a middle-class neighborhood. She now owned a mansion in the upscale Beacon Hill area. She also ran her own interior design company. How did you get such money? Caroline wondered. She continued her investigation, beginning to contact former colleagues and neighbors. Many refused to talk to her, but some people did listen. Caroline, I never expected to see you again, Martha, a former colleague, met with her at a small cafe. Honestly, I didn't think you would come out of prison. I'm alive, somehow, Caroline smiled. Martha, did anything change after I was gone? Martha thought for a moment. Well, your husband's company went bankrupt. Right after his disappearance. Bankruptcy? Caroline was surprised. She had thought James's bank was stable. Yes, a massive fraud was uncovered. But? Caroline prompted. Did you know that Diane suddenly became wealthy right after your husband's company went bankrupt? Martha said in a low voice. She started taking overseas trips and buying luxury cars. Everyone was wondering about it. Caroline's heart raced. This was an important clue. She continued her investigation and discovered that Diane's interior design company had been established 1 year after James disappeared. And the initial investment was too large to be explained by her salary. Next, Caroline began investigating her parents. She hadn't forgotten that they too had testified against her. According to records, Margaret and Howard Johnson were still alive and living in a luxury retirement community in Florida. They couldn't afford to live there on just their pension, Caroline murmured. As her investigation progressed, Caroline began to monitor Diane. She observed Diane's daily routine, her social connections, and her company's activities. To get more detailed information, she even rented an apartment in Diane's neighborhood. While continuing her surveillance, Caroline made a strange discovery. Diane regularly visited the Florida community where Caroline's parents lived. Why would these two, who should have no official connection, have such an intimate relationship? There must be a big connection, Caroline was convinced. Seeking decisive evidence, Caroline made a dangerous plan. Knowing that Diane would be away for the weekend, she used a fake ID to enter Diane's house disguised as a cleaning service. Inside the house, she headed for Diane's home office. She sat down at the computer and used the hacking skills she had learned in prison to bypass the password protection. Please, let me find something, she whispered prayerfully as she began searching through the files. And what caught her eye was a folder labeled JW Project. With trembling hands, she clicked on it, and there were email exchanges that would change her life. Old email exchanges between Diane and James. The emails dated back several years before Caroline's arrest. The two were in a love affair and had discussed James's fraudulent activities at the bank. And most shockingly, there were details of a plan to frame Caroline and get the insurance money. We'll use Caroline's medication to put her to sleep, leave fake evidence. She'll go to prison for murder, and will disappear with the $5 million from the insurance and $20 million from the bank. Caroline stared at the screen, feeling like she couldn't breathe. But that wasn't all. Her parents had also cooperated with this plan. Margaret, Howard, don't worry, an email from James to her parents read. When Caroline goes to prison, I'll provide you with a new home as promised. Your testimony is important. Caroline copied the evidence with trembling hands and saved it to a USB drive. Before leaving the house, she returned everything to its original state. Back at her apartment, she collapsed on the floor and couldn't stop crying. Her husband, best friend, and even her parents had betrayed her. 15 years of her life had been stolen because of their greed. However, in Caroline, sorrow gradually turned into anger and determination. She had evidence. Now, it was her turn to let the world know the truth. She first contacted a local journalist, Sarah Collins. Sarah was young and ambitious, and showed strong interest in Caroline's story. This is going to be big, Sarah said after checking the contents of the USB drive. We need to investigate thoroughly. Sarah and Caroline began working together to gather additional evidence. Sarah's article was published in a local newspaper and soon attracted national attention. Woman who served 15 years for an innocent crime discovers evidence of husband's survival and conspiracy, the headline shocked the judicial system. The case was reopened, and new evidence was considered. The FBI joined the investigation and began tracking international money flows. And there was another surprising discovery. One of the police officers who had handled Caroline's case had received a large sum of money from James. This is one of the greatest judicial errors in recent years, the prosecutor stated at a press conference. Caroline Walker is innocent, and her conviction will be overturned. Caroline watched the announcement on TV, quietly crying. After 15 years of nightmare, the truth had finally been revealed. However, she still had one final question: where was James? On the day Caroline's innocence was officially confirmed, Boston was covered with thick clouds. Dozens of cameras followed her as she descended the courthouse steps. 15 years ago, she had descended those same steps as a criminal. Now, she was the focus of national attention as a victim of an unjust judicial system. Mrs. Walker, what will you do now? A reporter shouted. Caroline paused for a moment and quietly said to the camera, the pursuit of truth is not over yet. I will find out where my husband, James Walker, is. Beside her stood FBI investigator Robert Carter. Since Caroline's case had been reopened, investigator Carter had become her greatest supporter. Mrs. Walker, let's talk at the office, he gently touched her elbow, moving her away from the press. In the quiet conference room of the FBI office, Caroline sat before Carter and his team. Materials about James and Diane were spread out on the desk. We've traced the flow of funds from James and Diane, investigator Carter began explaining. The insurance money and the embezzled funds from the bank were transferred through multiple offshore accounts, ultimately to a small country in South America, Uruguay. Uruguay? Caroline raised an eyebrow. Yes. A luxury resort area called Punta del Este near Montevideo, female investigator Linda pointed to a map. According to our information, a luxurious beachfront villa has been purchased there. In the names of Michael Johnson and Diana Johnson. Caroline gasped. Johnson, that's my maiden name. They were using your family name, investigator Carter nodded. Probably as irony. I need to go there, Caroline said firmly. That's the plan, Carter smiled at her. We're working with Uruguayan authorities on charges of international fraud and murder conspiracy. We'll fly to Montevideo with the team tomorrow. We'd like you to come along. The next day, Caroline boarded an international flight for the first time in her life. As she flew above the clouds visible from the window, she reflected on her 15 years in prison, the cold walls of her cell, the hostility of other inmates, the lonely days with no visitors. And now, she was about to face the moment of confronting those who had betrayed her. Upon arriving in Montevideo, the FBI team immediately joined local police. They headed to Punta del Este and began surveillance. The white mansion built along the coast was indeed the residence of the Johnson couple. "We need to understand their daily routine," Investigator Carter said. "After a few days of surveillance, we'll arrest them at the optimal time." Through surveillance cameras, Caroline saw her husband for the first time in 15 years. James had gained some weight and his hair had turned white, but his walk and laugh remained as she remembered. And beside him was Diane. She wore luxury brand clothes and large sunglasses. The two seemed to be enjoying a perfect wealthy lifestyle. They appear to have dinner at a restaurant called La Marina every Friday, Investigator Linda reported. Tomorrow night would be optimal for the arrest. Friday evening, Caroline waited in a police van. Her heart was pounding heavily. Investigator Carter fitted her with a vest, preparing for any contingency. "They've arrived," a voice came through the communication device. Caroline watched through the monitor as James and Diane entered the restaurant. They were guided to a terrace seat and ordered champagne. "Are you ready?" Carter asked her. Caroline took a deep breath and nodded. "I've been waiting for this moment for 15 years." The team entered the restaurant and headed to the terrace. Caroline walked a little behind the officers. They reached the table just as James and Diane were clinking glasses, laughing. James noticed them first, and the smile disappeared from his face. When Diane turned around, the color drained from her face. "Hello, James," Caroline said calmly. "It's a strange feeling meeting a dead man." "Caroline." James was at a loss for words. "How?" "I spent 15 years in prison because of you." Caroline's voice was quiet, but her eyes burned with anger. "But today I'm returning the favor." Diane tried to stand up from her chair, but an officer placed a hand on her shoulder. "Michael Johnson, also known as James Walker," Investigator Carter formally said. "I am arresting you on charges of international fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to murder." James suddenly overturned the table and tried to escape. However, he was apprehended by officers after just a few steps. Diane collapsed in tears, falling to her knees. "Caroline, please," she said crying. "Help me." Caroline stared at her former best friend for a long time. "Why, Diane? We were as close as sisters." "He loved me." Diane raised her face. "You had everything, a wonderful house, a successful career, a perfect husband. I had nothing." "And now you have nothing," Caroline said quietly and turned away. Upon returning to America, the trial of James and Diane began. The media called the case the betrayal of the century, attracting national attention. Caroline's parents were also arrested and charged with conspiracy. The trial revealed that James had embezzled millions of dollars from the bank. His relationship with Diane had continued for nearly 10 years, and they had meticulously planned to frame Caroline. The defendants stole an innocent woman's life, the prosecution stated in their closing argument. Their plan was cold, calculated, and selfish. On the day the verdict was announced, the courtroom was full. Caroline sat quietly, watching as the people who had once destroyed her life were brought into court. James and Diane were each sentenced to 25 years. They were found guilty of murder conspiracy, fraud, money laundering, perjury, and obstruction of justice. Considering their age, Caroline's parents received 10-year sentences. After the sentences were handed down, Caroline finally felt a sense of release. She received $10 million in compensation and could start a new life. However, the money could not bring back the 15 years of time she had lost. "What do you plan to do now?" Sarah Collins asked her after the verdict. Caroline smiled. I'm going to help people like me. Those who have been wrongfully convicted, those who have been betrayed. True to her word, Caroline established a foundation for prison reform and support for wrongful conviction victims. She compiled her experiences into a book and traveled around the country giving lectures. Her story moved many people and strengthened calls for judicial system reform. Meanwhile, James and Diane suffered difficult days in prison. James was severely injured in an attack by other inmates, and Diane completely broke down mentally. Caroline's parents suffered health problems in prison, and Margaret died in the 3rd year. They are facing the consequences of their actions, Caroline quietly stated at a press conference. I don't forgive them. But I won't be controlled by them anymore. 5 years later, Caroline opened a cafe called Second Chance on a small street in Boston. The cafe employed women released from prison, taking their first steps toward reintegration into society. On the wall inside the store, her words were framed. True family is not about blood relations, but about those who don't betray you. We can recreate our own families. In the quiet twilight, Caroline sat on the cafe's terrace, watching people passing by on the street. Traces of past pain remained on her face, but her eyes held a peaceful light. She took a sip of coffee and smiled. Hey, boss, Jessica, a young female employee, approached her. The support group people have arrived. Caroline stood up and headed inside. There, people who had been victims of the judicial system just like her had gathered. The scars visible on their faces resembled those Caroline saw every day in the mirror. Hello, everyone, she greeted them warmly. Today, let's talk about the theme of new beginnings. Gathered around the cafe tables, they shared their experiences, sufferings, and hopes. As Caroline listened to their words, she reflected on her own long journey. It would be difficult for her to fully trust again. But she had found meaning in her past by supporting other wrongful conviction victims. Outside, the sun was setting over Boston. Caroline looked up at the sky visible through the window and took a deep breath. 15 years ago, she had looked up at the same sky on the yacht. Then, there had been only despair, but now there was hope. We can all become the protagonists of our own stories, she said to the group. Even if others try to steal our stories from us. In the warm light of the cafe, Caroline Walker's new chapter continued. Her life had been stolen, but her spirit had never been broken. And now, she had become a beacon for others walking the same path. The truth may sometimes sink to the bottom of the sea, but it will always eventually rise to the surface. That was the most valuable lesson Caroline had learned.